Let's see. Mr. Randolph, would you like to go ahead, and then we'll ask the questions?
Sure, I can go ahead.
But try to keep it to about 5 minutes.
I will
been running over.
try to keep it as short as I can, and I'm going to leave Mr. Pettengill's copyrighted duck chart up there because it's a good demonstration. So a lot of my points have already been hit on, so I'll skip over those. Though it's important to note, I mean, the first panel with Dr. Hart and Dr. Bushnell, I agree with everything they've said completely. However, on almost everything they've said, it's more complex than they put it. And not to fault them on that, but for example, when we're talking about the cost of renewables versus the cost of conventional, and the conversation of what's the avoided cost and are there stranded assets, and we've correctly talked about the fact that a number of the conventional generation plants that exist today are Eisenhower era plants. They're 50-plus years old. Their lifetime is done. So those plants are coming offline for various reasons. Some are being replaced by newer, more efficient plants. Some will not, as Mr. Pettengill mentioned, be replaced at all. That makes it even harder to do the cost comparison, and the contracts utilities sign with conventional doesn't look like a contract they sign with renewable. For renewable, it's what's called a must-take contract, where every kilowatt hour or megawatt hour that plant produces, the utility has to buy. So it's really easy when we value it to look at that on a megawatt hour basis. We know what the expected output of that plant is. We can say, okay, they're going to produce so many a year. That comes out to 7 cents per megawatt hour, or $70 per megawatt hour. For a gas plant, what they're really paying for is capacity. They're really paying for that plant to sit around and be available a few hours during the year. So the more that we put renewable online or other resources where we don't need that plant, the less the plant actually runs, the more the megawatt hours that are produced from it cost relative to the fossil plant or the renewable plant, but it's providing a different service. So it's hard to compare those to each other. And I bring that up. That's a challenge that we have is we're trying to figure out how to do things like least cost, best fit, because the benefits that they provide to the grid are very different, and it's sometimes very hard to balance those. Another thing that's much more difficult than what was pointed out, and it's the reason why I left the duck chart up here, if you notice that all the charts everybody put up there, with the exception of the scatter plot diagram, they all were either set April or this one here, March 31st. Those were all examples of a winter day. A summer day looks very different. A summer day does not have this belly of the duck in there. And so what's important there is as we start to plan for 40 and 50% renewable, we've got two different paradigms. We've got the winter and we've got the summer, and they're very different. So that's another challenge. And then lately, most of the conversation in Sacramento has been over this overgen problem, which is the belly of the duck. That's one thing we have to plan for. But the other thing we need to plan for is that neck of the duck. And that's also potentially very different sets of solutions. So I bring all that up to show that it's a little more complicated out there. Now, what can we do for all of this stuff? The next slide, actually, I'll bring it up so you can look at it. Mr. Pettengill did a number of things that we can do. The commission, these are all things that we are looking at in proceedings now that impact that. And in no particular order. Demand response, energy efficiency, contract reform. What that means is some of these renewable contracts that say that you can't curtail, there can be changes in those contracts to actually allow them to be used a little bit more efficiently. Reform on how we value RA on some of the renewables, diversity in the overall fleet within California, the renewable fleet, the regional diversity, changes in rate design so that there's better price incentives sent to customers at different times of the year, smart electric vehicle charging. Electric vehicles coming online can benefit both to the overall carbon reduction, but also helping us manage the grid by creating load at times we need load. Distribution grid reform and more technologies on the distribution grid. A specific example of that would be we're now allowing customer side of the meter solar to use smart inverters, which allow them to provide some services to the distribution grid that can help with some of these things. Storage. Storage could be a big help. I'm a little more optimistic on the price of solar in the future. future, just some of the stuff I've seen now. It's not, to your question, the only solution. In part, there are times where it's going to need to be able to store 4 or 6 hours, and there aren't a lot of storage technologies that can store that long, so you need a mix there. And so that's the list of the things that are out there that we're working on. All of those can help. If we can do all of those things and balance them in the right way, I think getting the 50% renewable is incredibly doable. I think we can do it in a way with very minimal cost impacts to the ratepayers, and I think we can do it in a way that maintains good reliability. But that gets to the heart of my presentation then, which is how do we do that? How do we balance all those things? And what I want to focus on is the regulatory approach on this. What needs to happen on the regulatory side? And there's a couple different options we can use as we move to a 50% renewable on the regulatory side to balance these. The first is basically status quo. Follow what we have today. And that approach is we have a legislatively specified RPS mandate. We have very specific energy efficiency targets. We have specific targets on storage, on biomass, on combined heat and power, and on other technologies. Each one of those targets, for various reasons, is either set in statute or set in their proceedings, but set independently of each other. What then happens with each one of those targets is they roll into a proceeding that the PUC we call the long-term planning proceeding, the LTPP. And in that, it takes all the inputs from the other, all the goals and mandates that already exist, and figures out the residual. And figures out the residual that we need for reliability. And historically, that residual has been just conventional. It hasn't looked at everything else. It hasn't tried to balance those. The approach has actually been fairly successful to date in getting us to 33%. Because all of these hard mandates send market signals to investors, to other, to the utilities, to others, so that they know where their investment is and where their risks are. However, the siloing approach also creates the challenges in integrating the resources out there. And an example of that is this right here, that we're looking at the overgeneration. I counted up the other day how many different proceedings are looking at the overgeneration. Right now, it's at least 8 different proceedings at the PUC. That's different commissioners, that's different judges, that's different sets of staff. That means it's inevitable that opportunities of maximum GHG reduction at the lowest ratepayer cost will be missed along the way. We can add to this approach more tools to help us better integrate, such as integration adders, which we've added this year, reform the least cost best fit to better value the renewables, which we're working on. But none of these are ever going to be perfect. They're always going to have some inaccuracies in them and aren't going to get us to where I think we ultimately need to be. A different approach, and there are multiple different approaches, but a different approach that we've been talking about some internally is an integrated resource planning approach. And under this approach, the agencies would set the greenhouse gas goals for the utilities and would also set other goals such as local air quality, resiliency, and development of the distribution grid. Then these goals would feed into a centralized proceeding at the PUC that would analyze marginal cost, emission reductions potentials of each of the various clean energy assets we could use, locational benefits, interactive effects of the resource mixes when they're procured together. And then that analysis would be used to set the specific targets for each of the resource types in a way that maximizes reliability, minimizes value, and reduces overall cost. And then from there, one of two things can happen. It can direct the utilities to do procurements to meet those specific goals, or it can feed into proceedings at the PUC to figure out how the utilities would meet those goals. But the goals are set in conjunction with everything, and then it feeds back out. It's important to note this approach wouldn't require regulators to start with a blank slate. We know from the studies that E3 has done for us and a number of other studies that have been done by other research institutions that we're going to have to get to 50%. We're going to have to go beyond 50%. That's just one of several we know are no regrets goals. So you can set this up where there continues to be a 50% target. But from there, the agency and the utilities and the parties at the agency in a proceeding can work together to figure out how all the other resources best blend in to get you to that target and get you to what our ultimate goal, which is the greenhouse gas reduction, is there. I mean, and this approach to, in our mind has a couple key advantages. One, as I just said, it's focused on our ultimate goal, which is greenhouse gas reduction, and not each of the programs is in and of themselves. And it creates a single venue at the PUC for the not just us, but for the stakeholders, for the utilities, for the ISO, to focus on the combination of those. And it better addresses the interplay between the electricity sector, the transportation sector, the industrial sector, and the building sector. All of these other sectors need to do things on their own that are ultimately going to need to feed back into the electricity sector to get their goals. And there are some drawbacks to this approach versus the current approach. An IRP could be a lengthier process. Modeling in that will be more difficult. It requires significant more either staff time or consultant time. And on this, this conversation is largely focused on the investor-owned utilities, on PG&E in Southern California Edison and San Diego Gas and Electric. We don't have the same authority, the PUC doesn't, over the community choice aggregators, over energy service providers, and definitely not over the publicly owned utilities. However, approach like this, some of these others, the reason why we don't have authority over them is we don't look at their cost structure. We don't guarantee rates of return for them. So that doesn't mean they can't on their own follow an integrated resource plan. And with that, I'll wrap up and available for questions.
You did run over 10 minutes, but it's okay. I think we all learned a lot.
Yeah.
I'm going to try and end this panel at 3, so we're going to not have that many questions. But the next panel is 7 people, and at 5 minutes each, that's 35 minutes. And with a few questions and some people running over, that'll take us till 4. And then we have to have the comment period. So that's what we'll try to do. Let me say this to Mr. Pettengill. So we have all these alternatives. We really need the ISO to look at a variety of these alternatives and to work with the other agencies to determine what the costs are so that we come up with the most cost-effective way of doing this. And only the ISO, so far as I know, has the capability to model the whole system. It has, well, for example, the E3 model has like 2 points. It models the difficulty of moving electricity from north to south, but that's it. You represent a large part of the grid. You have like, I don't know, 800, 900 points, something like that?
Well, we have 5,000 pricing points just for California. 5,000
pricing points. And then, so you have the model. You can look at congestion along the lines, et cetera. We really need you to do a quantitative study. And I'm sure you will, right?
Yes. In fact, I was going to say, and turn to Ed, maybe you can refresh my memory where we are in the next LTPP, because I think what was scoped out is for us to introduce a 50% study, similar to what we did here, where we did a 40% study in last year's long-term procurement proceedings. So I'm reasonably confident that we will be producing a 50% analysis that can go into the LTPP and get to the point that you're talking about. What is the right mix?
Yeah, so you would need to do multiple studies for that. This is just one, yes, which is business as usual. You'd want another one where you looked at storage and some of these other things, another one looking at others. I'm sure that those who run these models and look at the results have some idea about what can be changed, and then look at because we don't want to make policy in a vacuum. We don't want to say, oh, the answer is batteries, until, at least this is my belief, until we've seen what can really work. So we really need you to do a lot of scenarios.
All right.
So we can understand the cost of the various options. So other questions are common. And by the way, you both gave great presentations, and I've learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. Go ahead, Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question about the solutions up there, and in particular the top one. It says target energy efficiency. And in some ways I can understand how that would help, because if you approve lighting efficiency, for example, that would help you in the time of days where there's a problem. But other kinds of efficiency, while laudable, would actually hurt you. So, for example, increased air conditioning efficiency would make things worse for you. Increased refrigeration efficiency wouldn't hurt you or help you, wouldn't help at all, in fact. Right. So can you talk a little bit more about that and what you mean by increased efficiency and why it helps?
From the PUC's perspective, I mean, one of the things we need to be able to do on energy efficiency, right now, most of our energy efficiency programs just look at an overall savings. And we don't really look at where that savings has happened geographically, which is actually an important feature, and what time of day that's happening. And so part of the increasing, and that's what the target energy efficiency means, is look at programs that would be targeted at the times of day that the savings is helpful. So at the peak of the day, so at the top of the neck of the duck, those type of programs would be helpful. We should target there. Also, geographically can be very important in this. We have a lot more need for energy efficiency right now in the LA basin than we do in other parts of the state that might have better access to transmission and generation right now.
And I'll just say, I really don't have anything to add, Ed. That's exactly right. Geographic and time of day, that's what we mean by targeting.
Okay, but if you're doing regional balancing, why do you still need to target geographically?
Well, the point here is to try to take that shape, that duck diagram shape, and try to levelize it as much as possible. And so as Ed was describing, trying to take the head of the duck down reduces the need for us to have gas resources, or for that matter, other flexible resources that can go all the way up that neck of the duck in terms of that ramping requirement. It potentially reduces capacity requirements if we're reducing the total peak load.
Okay. I think we're talking about different things.
Okay.
But I think your question on if we're doing regional balancing, why would we want to regionally target energy efficiency? There's still going to be cases, some of this may be on a shorter term period, some may be longer, where even if you can get wind from Wyoming to California, you can't get it to Long Beach. Or I think more importantly, what Long Beach may need is, because of their load, some voltage support, some other things out there that energy efficiency or some other technologies could help with. And you either got to build a new transmission line at that point or do some energy efficiency. And I think a lot of people would prefer we do more energy efficiency than build the new transmission line.
Right. So what I heard you say is that the limitations of our transmission infrastructure prevent us from regionally load balancing to the degree that we would like to, and that's why we need to target geographically.
I think so, though I'd go a little further. I think what you may be implying is a term I just recently learned, which is copper plating, which is having a distribution transmission grid where everything flows freely in every single direction. And that would be an ideal if you didn't care about cost. And you still got to balance that cost issue. So you still may look at it and say, we can get something from Wyoming into California, but what's the most cost-effective way to deal with that issue within Long Beach? And then again, that might be building new transmission. It might be energy efficiency or demand response or another tool.
That's right.
All right. Thank you.
Those were great questions. Thank you. Yes, Brian, or Mr.
So I'm interested in the other providers in other states and how that would meld into the policies that we've set here and the goals. What's your take on that and how that we would? I mean, I obviously know you do that right now. You buy energy when we need energy and get rid of energy when we don't need it. But what's the long term as a Western-wide policy? What's your view on that? How would it work?
Well, this is
or
really...
maybe how does it work now? I'm not familiar with exactly how it works.
So, all right, fair enough. Let me sort of start with how it works now. What's happening now is the ISO operates really pretty much exclusively within California. There's a little bit of load in Nevada, but for the most part, we're operating exclusively in California. And as I was describing earlier with the energy imbalance market, one of the things that's happening is there's 39 different balancing authorities in the western states. All of them are operating completely independent. So as Assemblyman Williams was asking me, well, what about all of our overgen? What about our renewable energy? Well, the reality of it is they don't know that we're necessarily going to have it. If what we do is we start bringing this together to a regional market, then as I was describing, we've got an opportunity to forecast our overgen conditions and be able to say, you don't need to run a power plant because we're going to have enough energy and we have to run it through our market design in order to make sure that there's enough transmission. but presumably there's enough transmission to sell that or move that energy to them. We've got an opportunity to help them reduce their emissions and us in order to be able to still run all of our renewable facilities. So that's generally the way it would work. Today, we're sort of restricted because the EIM is only letting us do what can be done in a 5 or 15-minute market. By adding more parties to the ISO's balancing authority, we start to get those broader benefits.